Jonathon is an ethnobotanist, a writer, and a natural products chemist. He's written 8 books, has just finished another one on literary inspiration that comes to him when writing. He's co-written 5 and contributed to 4 more. He's published a ton of articles on entheogens, and indeed was one of the people that coined the term with Gordon Wasson, Carl Ruck, and Richard Schultes. Jonathon's books are encyclopedic in their scope, and books that I refer back to time and time again. In fact, 2 of them happen to be definitely on my top 10 psychedelic books of all time. Jonathon organized the now legendary Palenque conferences, seminars in the late 90s, together with Terence McKenna, Rob Montgomery, and Ken Symington, and has spoken at numerous psychedelic seminars over the decades. He lives in Mexico, where he has an ethnobotanical garden and a natural products chemistry lab. And we are really blessed to have him here because he doesn't travel that much anymore. So please, can we give him a round of applause and welcome Jonathon.
Thank you. Yeah, I wish to speak about the terminology for what everyone is calling psychedelics, and give it a little historical context, where the words for visionary drugs came from, where the science started. I thought I had more time. I'm going to have to condense it a little bit, and they'll have to drag me off the stage. But anyway, it was 1806 that the science of phytochemistry began. A young apprentice pharmacist in northern Germany isolated what he called morphium or morphine from the opium, the gum of opium. At that time, everyone thought the key discovery he made, this is the first time a secondary compound not involved in primary metabolism of all organisms had been isolated from any organism. And at that time, it was thought that they would perforce be, we're getting feedback, they would perforce be acidics to be soluble in the cytosol, in the aqueous environment inside living cells. He made the key discovery that it was alkaline. And 10 years later, the French chemist, everyone doubted that, and he was just a young nobody. And it went against the reigning theory, and it proved to be a key discovery that they were alkaline. And so a prominent French chemist, 10 years later, 1816, invented the term alkaloid, meaning alkaline-like, alkaloid in English. And throughout the 19th century, a great number of alkaloids were isolated using the technology that he had developed, which I won't go into, I haven't time for. But among those were, in 1852, also speak of ones that are relevant to shamanic pharmacognosy. 1852, harmine was isolated in Germany from the seeds of Perganum harmala. It was much later found in Banisteriopsis caapi, or Yahe ayahuasca. 1860 in Germany, cocaine was isolated. These are all alkaloids. Alkaloid just means it's a natural product, meaning it is found in nature, and it is alkaline. It has nitrogen in it. It doesn't specify structure or activity at all. But you might be interested in knowing that there are more than 10,000 alkaloids known now, and more than half of them are indole alkaloids with the same basic nucleus of DMT, 5-methoxy, LSD, and so forth. Also nicotine, which is what I was just taking, was isolated in 1832. But the first visionary compound to be isolated was done in Germany in 1895 by a man named Arthur Hefter. And you may have heard of the Hefter Foundation. Before this, almost a decade before, Louis Levine, who I will mention later, had been the first to find alkaloids in the Cactaceae, or the cactus family, which is a New World genus. It wasn't found in the Old World naturally, but he isolated only one alkaloid, and he did no testing on it, and I don't believe he even had tried peyote. He made a trip to the United States and brought it back from Detroit, from the Park Davis Pharmaceutical Company. But what Hefter did, and what I call the Hefter technique, is he tried the peyote to know what the effect was like. He isolated 4 different alkaloids, and then he tested them on himself, which I call a psychonautic bioassay. A psychonaut is a term that it was invented by the great German writer Ernst Jünger, who was Albert Hofmann's best friend. This was the only way these visionary compounds can be identified. You need some kind of bioassay to get an active medicinal agent out of the plants. You're looking for an antibiotic, so you have some cell culture, whatever, bacteria that you see if it kills it. That's a bioassay. But the psychonautic bioassay is in a human being. And the visionary effect, which some people call psychedelic, I think quite wrongly, it cannot be seen clearly in laboratory animals. I don't think it's ethical to use them at all, because you can't, you're just wasting their lives. You can't see it. So Hefter tested them on himself, and on the 27th of November, 1897, he determined that what he called mescaline, with a Z and a K, was the primary active visionary principle of peyote. He said it represented the main visionary effect of the crude drug. And so that was the first time we had a pure compound. That was the first trip with a crystalline substance. This is pure, naturally isolated from the cactus. But peyote is a very small plant, very slow growing. It has no spines. It defends itself by alkaloids. It has over 50. It's extremely toxic. It's not my ally. I love the plant. I have 2 beautiful ones at home that are older than I am. But older than I am, they're only about this big. And only the upper part of it is active. And it only grows from central Mexico up to the Rio Bravo Valley, which is or Rio Grande, the river that separates Texas from several Mexican states. And it only grows within 20 kilometers of the river in the United States. It's not uncommon in Mexico. It wouldn't say that it is threatened, but today it is illegal to harvest it because of the CITES Treaty, the Convention on International Traffic of Endangered Species. All cacti are considered that, and so you cannot traffic in it. And it's too slow growing and too rare to support widespread use. So there was a little tentative pharmacology with, not with Hefter's mescaline, but with extracts of peyote, Havelock Ellis, a USAN, or someone from the United States, a psychologist, and also Silas Weir Mitchell, a Scottish pharmacologist, did self-experiments and wrote about it, but there was no real scientific advance because it wasn't available. In 1919, another German named Ernst Spade synthesized mescaline and proved that its structure was 3,4,5-trimethoxy beta-phenethylamine, a very simple compound, and it's very closely related structurally to all the tryptamines, including LSD. LSD is a tryptamine as well. It has almost the entire DMT molecule incorporated in its structure. Tryptamine just means indole ethylamine, an indole ring, which is a benzene ring with a 5-membered side ring with a nitrogen, and then ethyl is 2 carbons and an amine and then a nitrogen. And if you cyclize that around, you have the nucleus of harmine. And if you add another, and that is called tryptamine, indole ethylamine. And if you add another indole ethylamine group to that, you get dimethyltryptamine. I'll speak a little bit more about that, but I don't wish to talk about chemistry. I have to go through this very quickly. In 1902, ibogaine was isolated in France. I'm just mentioning the visionary ones, but a growing amount of them. But Spate's synthesis of this made mescaline available for pharmacological research, which otherwise could not have taken place. There just wasn't enough peyote, and it is very much endangered. The Native American Church of North America is only legally allowed to harvest it in the United States, where it only grows in 5 counties, and it's almost all private land, and it's very scarce there. I've been there, and you only see little tiny ones, and they're few and far between. So they must be bringing it in as contraband from Mexico, which is in violation of the CITES Treaty. Besides, it's a Schedule I controlled substance, the plant itself in the United States. Then in the 1920s, there was considerable pharmacological research with mescaline. And that was, there were 3 books. Kurt Beringer published Der Mescalinrausch, which means the mescaline inebriation. He was from Berlin, a German. And a French pharmacologist, Alexandre Rouillet, published La plante qui fait les yeux émerveillés, the plant that enmarvels the eyes, le peyote. Its real name is peyote, with the accent on the first syllable, peyote. These were human pharmacological experiments, in both cases involving some hundreds of human subjects. And then Heinrich Klüver published a book called Mescal about similar research that was done here in England. So we had, within 3 years, or 2 years, 27, 28, 29, there were 3 very comprehensive books on the pharmacology of mescaline. But no one had a particular word for this kind of substance that were basically unknown to science. And the first ethnopharmacognosy, or mention of this, was in the middle of the 19th century. And within 5 years, there were 3 pioneering books. The first was called The Chemistry of Common Life, and this was written by a Scotchman named James Johnston. He was an agricultural chemist. And it's a 2-volume book. It's really the first textbook of what we now call biochemistry. At the time, it was thought that our chemistry was different from, the lab chemistry was different from living things. We now know that it is, and it's just done in a different way. But ever more, that way is being imitated. The first one was 1855. There were 2 volumes. The second volume came out in 1855. Almost the whole of it was devoted to the narcotics we indulge in. So he described the Siberian fungus, Amanita muscaria, the coca leaf, opium, caffeine plants, the solanaceae, henbane, mandrake, etc., datura, and a couple of others, 6 or 7. But the word that was used in the 19th century was narcotics. And narcotics comes from narcoticum. It means a somniferous drug. We now use it specifically for opioids, which are not somniferous drugs in the doses ordinarily used, either for pleasure or for pain relief. But that was the reigning word. Then that same year, within 2 months, this is the kind of synchronicity that happens in science. Often the world has to be ready for a certain level of interest and ability to integrate knowledge. And it's common that certain things are discovered in 2 or 3 or even 4 different laboratories almost simultaneously. There's nothing weird or eerie about this. It's what the Germans called Zeitgeist. The world is not ready for this information, and so it doesn't come out. But when it is, the society, the times, whatever. So then this book came out only 2 months later. It was by a German baron named Ernst Freiherr von Bibera. Bibera means beaver. He was an amateur scientist, not a professional like or chemist and professor like Johnston, but he covered almost the same material. And his book was entitled Die narkotischen Genussmittel und der Mensch, which means narcotic dainties and humankind. Genussmittel means means of pleasure, but I would translate it in English as dainties, a special food. And drugs are foods. They're not different. It's just a social distinction between a drug and food. To me, they're a type of alimentation. But this is very close together. But they both use this word, narcotic. Then 5 years later, the British mycologist Mordecai Cubitt Cook published The Seven Sisters of Sleep, a history of the 7 prevailing narcotics of the world. And so they were using narcotic in the sense of psychoactive because it had stimulating plants like caffeine and coca. It had somewhat somniferous plants and also vision plants. So throughout the second half of the 19th century and well into the 20th, any psychoactive plant was called a narcotic. And it's a misused term still, but it specifically now has more of a legal designation. It means an illegal drug in the law, and it means opiates in pharmacy. Okay, so, and that was 1860. That was the same year cocaine was isolated in Germany. It was the same year Baudelaire published Les Paradis Artificiels, which was about opium and cannabis and alcohol, which he called artificial paradises. And I wrote a book calling Pharmacophilia, the natural paradises, because these are the natural paradises that come from nature. Artificial means by human artifice or animal artifice, because animals do this too. And they use drugs and they fashion tools. And they are just as conscious as we are and way more intelligent in what they need to do than we are. But maybe we may see them as dumb because they can't speak or they can't write books or whatever. So they were narcotics. And then 24 years later, 1874, another Britisher, Richard Spruce, who was the chief inspiration of Richard Evans Schultes. I'm taking up way too much time on just the introduction. This is the problem. I expected to have more time. Anyway, I'll speed it up. So he traveled all across the Amazon. He was the first scientist to try yahe or ayahuasca, and also the nyopo snuff, which is tryptamines, bufotenine, the most potent of the short-acting tryptamines. But it took him a long time. He crossed it on foot. He was like a bureaucrat, and they said, "Oh, go from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast." It took him like 10 years to get there. And along the way, he made fantastic plant collections. So he published an article in a geographical magazine, but he called them remarkable narcotics of the Amazon and Orinoco Valley. ocean highways. That was the title of his article. So there were narcotics to spruce as well. And finally, in 1939, Schultes, who was inspired by him when he was a young student, was the first to collect botanical specimens or mycological specimens of the Maria Sabinas mushrooms from Mexico. And his article was entitled Teonanacatl, which means wondrous mushroom in Nahuatl, a narcotic basidiomycete of the Aztecs. So he also used the word narcotic for this. Okay, so then suddenly we have only mescaline. Ibogaine was not much tested in human beings. Harmine was, but for curing Parkinsonism, it didn't prove to be, and harmine is not really visionary by itself. It's more pure hallucination. What's in Banisteriopsis or Yahe ayahuasca, it causes your blue flashes on the retina. It's kind of like a true hallucinogen, but it's not really visionary. It activates tryptamines, cocaine, nicotine, solanaceous alkaloids, and many other things that are put into these potions. And so, but really the only vision drug known was this mescaline. And then in the 1920s, we had these 3 books on the pharmacology of mescaline. Then Louis Levine, who I had said in 1888 first isolated alkaloids from the Cactaceae, but didn't test them on himself from peyote. But they'd never been found in any other species of cactus. He published a very important book called Fantastica. And this was the first classification of psychoactive drugs. He had 5 different categories, and I'll only mention one because I don't have enough time. But he called these drugs fantasticants, or fantastica, Latinized, fantasticants. And all 3 books from the middle of the 19th century covered essentially the same 7 or 8 drugs. And there was very little ethnographic information available at the time. But and Levine, there were a few more, but not many. It covered the same ones, but a few more. But we didn't have much information then. But that was 1924. I think it was translated into French, Italian, and English. The English edition was read by Aldous Huxley on the French Riviera when he was writing Brave New World. And this was part of his inspiration. This idea of the soma drug came from Levine's book, which Huxley very specifically stated was very badly written and horribly dull and so forth. But it nonetheless inspired him. And he wrote that and published that novel around 1932. I don't know the precise date. And so, Levine, just before he died, he published the first monograph on Banisteriopsis. And he called it Ein neues Rauschgift und Heilmittel. He called it Banisteria KAP. That was what Spruce named it. KAP is its name in the Tucano region in southern Colombia. KAP is that, and AP is coca. And coca, tobacco, and Banisteriopsis, which is the true trinity in Amazonia, the 3 principal entheogens. But coca and tobacco are much more important than Banisteriopsis historically, currently, and in terms of distribution and number of people that use them. So this new term came out, fantasticum. It didn't catch fire. It hung fire, shall we say. And then, of course, Bicycle Day, which was celebrated last night. I was celebrating it last weekend in Basel, but before the real day. On the 27th of November, 1938, Albert Hofmann synthesized what he called LSD-25, lyserzoyl-diethylamide. It was the 25th compound in a series of derivatives of ergonomine, which is the uterotonic principle of ergot, which was investigated because midwives used it traditionally. His job was to make derivatives. This was the number 25. That was 41 years to the day after Arthur Hefter's bioassay with 150 milligrams of mescaline sulfate in 1897. It's just curious it happened on the same calendar day. 41 years later. But the pharmacologists in the company said this is no good because they couldn't see the effect in the research animals, mice or whatever they were using, and it was only 70% as uterotonic as ergonovine, which they already had as a commercial product. So he said, give us something else, and that was his job, and then he was supposed to toss that aside. But Albert always said he couldn't forget the compound. He had dreams about it. This also has occurred in science. Auguste Kekule fell asleep on the streetcar and dreamed the benzene structure. They couldn't figure out this cyclohexane. It's hexane, 6 carbon atoms, but nobody could imagine that it could be a ring, cyclohexane, what we call benzene. And he dreamed it. Anyway, that's not to the point. So 5 years later, everyone knows the story. He going against the rules of his company, he made a second batch of it. And on the 16th of April, somehow absorbed. He was a very sensitive man, a small man, a super sensitive man, extremely intelligent, of course, and aware. He felt something from this, and it reminded him of like a spontaneous mystical experience he'd had as a youth in the forest. And so it was a Friday, he went back to the lab on Saturday. He thought the first thing, it must have breathed some of the solvents. It was ethyl acetate, so he stuck his head in a tank of ethyl acetate and he just got a little drunk. So the following Monday, he decided, okay, well, I'll try a very small dose of this, and then I'll work my way up to see if that's what caused the experience. So he took 1/4 milligram, which was much below the normal dose of the ergot alkaloids used medicinally, which is, we call 250 micrograms. And it's a substantial dose, especially for a first dose. Never mind the first dose ever in the world or in history. And that story is well told. But so it was divulged to the world. It was patented, published chemically, and patented by Sandoz as delicide, delicid, from the name D-lysergic acid diethylamide. They intended to sell it as a psychiatric adjuvant aid in 100 microgram ampules, not necessarily made for injection. They were just packaged that way, but they could be injected, but also in 25 microgram pills as a stimulant, because in 25 microgram dose, it's virtually indistinguishable from methamphetamine and lasts about as long, but it doesn't make your hand shake. It has many fewer side effects. It's a very good stimulant in low doses. And it's always euphoric, and that's because of this amphetamine-like effect. And that's a ring related to mescaline, the amphetamines. To 1947, Hofmann's boss, Arthur Stoll, his son happened to be a psychiatrist in practice in Zurich. He published a paper on it, and he called it Ein neues Phantasticum aus dem Mutterkorngruppe, which means a new fantasticant from the ergot group. And so he used the Levine's word, and it was introduced to the world as a fantasticant. Unfortunately, phantasm means an illusion, basically. It's not a felicitous term, but it's interesting that Levine chose that of his 5 groups of psychoactive drugs as his title, Fantastica. He wasn't a psychonaut. I don't think he ever took any of them, but he was the first to isolate alkaloids from peyote and the first to publish a monograph on banisteria. And he also isolated harmine from it, but he thought it was a new alkaloid. He called it banisterine. That's not to the point. But so LSD was introduced to the world as a fantastic one. Then in 1953 in London, a pamphlet, just a pamphlet, was published which introduced the word hallucinogen. It was called the hallucinogenic drugs by a man named Johnson, no relation to Johnston, the Scot of the Chemist of Common Life. But he didn't invent the word. It was invented by 3 psychiatrists, one Canadian, Abram Hoffer, one Britisher, John Smithies, and Humphrey Osmond, who was kind of like Anglo-Canadian. He was 1 foot in each side, but they didn't use the term until the following year. And so for the psychiatric world, they became hallucinogens, and the fantastic, to my knowledge, was maybe, I don't know of any other use of it after Levine, except in the title of the introduction of the effects of LSD on human patients in a psychiatric setting. And so and these people, Humphrey Osmond especially, invented what is called psychedelic therapy, and as distinct from psycholytic therapy. There were 2 currents, and it was only LSD. That was the only drug that was a hallucinogen or a psychodyspeptic or a psychotomimetic or a psychedelic. It was the only one available and known to them at the time. And I can't stress that too much because it really applies to that one drug. And how that came about, in 1954, Humphrey Osmond was kind of like a Pied Piper of these visionary compounds, and he went to Los Angeles, where Aldous Huxley then lived, and introduced him to 400 milligrams of mescaline sulfate. And everyone knows Huxley wrote 2 very influential essays, The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell, which are taken from, in my opinion, the best poem in the world, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where William Blake says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everyone, I can't remember, it doesn't matter. And I'm taking too much time on this. Okay, so Huxley had a huge awakening, and he wrote very cogently about this. And he said it's not a mind-expanding drug, it's a mind-reducing drug. It's like a reducing valve. And this is what I also think. It doesn't expand. If you get the right dose, I say you can't take too much, but you can take too little. And some people should never take it at all, but I mean, for me, that's the case. He said it brings focus and concentration and presence, attention in the moment, which is the goal of all meditation that I know about, and so forth. So he called it a reducing bubble. I call it a translinguistic state. It wipes the linguistic programming away and the ego that goes with it. So you cannot objectify. You can't put a name to this as a cup and a table. You can only experience them directly, and you can't speak. I lose Spanish first, then German first, then Spanish, and when I can't speak English, okay, now I've made it. But, you know, I'm not there, sort of, but there's always something there. It can be very frightening if you haven't experienced it before. But that, to me, is ecstasy, which means standing outside of oneself. That's the etymological meaning of ecstasy, and it literally means to separate the mind or the consciousness or the center from the body, not astral projection, just your awareness being outside of your body, outside of the material realm and in the energetic realm, because everything, Blake also wrote in that poem, energy is eternal delight. Everything is made of energy. There really isn't nothing solid, but I spoke of that the last time, and it's in the last BC book. They were, Osmond and Huxley were exchanging letters, and they were being cute and came up with some doggerel, and it's really doggerel. Osmond said, to fathom hell or soar angelic, try a pinch of psychedelic. So he invented the word psychedelic. And Huxley said, to make this trivial world sublime, take a half a gram of phanerothyme. And phanerothyme didn't catch on, but there were a couple books that used it in the title. And psychedelic did catch on, and I'll tell you how that came. But it is really psychodelic. There are hundreds of words in English, French, German that use psycho as a prefix in the sense of mind. There are none in any of those languages that use psyche. They both mean the same thing. They mean breath or breathing, because the Greeks thought that the consciousness was in the lungs, and that the breath was the animating spirit. And this is even seen in Christian mythology. It was stolen from other sorts of a mishmash, nothing original. I'll try not to talk about religion because I don't like it. Then psychedelic. So that word came out. But the psychiatrists were already arguing over, should we call them hallucinogens, psychotomimetics, or psychosomimetics, because they thought what it was good for was not to help patients, but to train psychiatrists, because they thought it made a model psychosis. And so without too much fuss and bother or trouble, and still making the golf game on the weekend, the trainees could have a model psychosis for 8 hours and learn what it was like to be wacko or nuts. Mad. And so this was pursued. They thought there was an endogenous schizotoxin. Schizophrenia basically means psychosis. And psychotomimetic mimics psychosis, or psychosomimetic. And that's also what psychodelic basically is a synonym of hallucinogen, which is a synonym of those. And I will explain that now, but I just want to say a few more words about how psychedelic came to be accepted. In 1963, Ralph Metzner, German, but who emigrated to the United States and lived and died there not too long ago, and a psychologist, and Timothy Leary, of course. They were not professors. They were contract lecturers at Harvard University. They started a journal called the Psychedelic Review, but with the E. Huxley would never spell it that way, because the correct etymology is psychodelic. And that's the way it is in many languages. In Castilian, it's psychodelico. And CK in French means a cheval mirror, a movable mirror for shaving. And no mind words are compounded of psyche, only of psycho, including psychotic, psychotropic, psychoactive, etc. So the Psychedelic Review, there were 11 numbers, and while it was under Ralph Metzner's editorship, the first 4 or 5, it was a serious journal. They reprinted some important articles by Gordon Wasson, Richard Evans Schultes, some original articles, and so forth. But Timothy Leary was like the Terence McKenna of his day. He wasn't a scientist. He was, a good, charismatic person, a good communicator, but he really didn't do serious research or publish scientific papers per se. Terence, none, and Leary, only a few, in my opinion, kind of cockamamie. But in any case, that's just my opinion. I try not to have firm opinions, because that's what belief means. I try not to have beliefs. we forget that belief is just an opinion, and it means a firm opinion. Somehow belief gets special treatment because it's God and all this. In any case, I don't want to go into that, or we'll be here all night. I'm going to shift this. Better see how much time I have. Okay, yeah, I'll get through this. Speed reading that nobody will be able to understand, just as I can't read my notes. So the Psychedelic Review came out, and there were only 11 numbers, but I have all of them. From about the 6th to the 11th, it degenerated into a dope comic, literally a dope comic. And the last one, there's an article on cannabis, and they spell it B-U-S. You couldn't even spell cannabis correctly, and it was just not serious at all. And Leary, I think, was already in prison by that time, and so forth. But he was, looking for fame and fortune more than scientific insight and so forth. But that's not my subject. Then in about 1960, let me get this right. In about 1968, it could be 1969, I'm not sure, the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs was started by a kind of student initiative, cooperative, or whatever, in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, which was the mecca of the hippies, and it still survives. But now it's called the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs. But until 1981, from 68 to 81, it was called the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs. So it was used in many book titles and so forth. And psychedelic caught on. But now I'm going to explain why it shouldn't be used. There's no need for any psychedelic renaissance, because in the first place, what is being called psychedelic renaissance never died, so it can't be reborn. And psychedelic is the wrong term for it. It's a pejorative term. Only in this circle, which is worldwide, but by percentage-wise it's very small of the human population, does it have a positive connotation. But in Mexico, where I live, psychedelic suggests gringo hippies and Charles Manson. They would never apply it to Maria Sabina. That's something else. That's ethnomedicine, and now they use the term entheogen. It's more used in Mexico than anywhere. And the Fondo de Cultura Económica, which republished all of Watson's works, and also translated our article on entheogens, 1979, in the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs, which 2 years later I said it should be changed, the title, and they did, but not to entheogenic drugs, but to psychoactive drugs, which is more appropriate because it doesn't just concern vision drugs. And so they really promoted the term. So there's no need for this to be reborn, and it shouldn't be called psychedelic. It shouldn't be called entheogenic either, because it's a medical context. So I want to give you some definitions of the basis of these words, and these are all out of the Oxford Encyclopedic English Dictionary. I normally use the original OED, but this is more recent, and so I took the definitions from that, and it's handier to get the information from. So, hallucinogen, the term, 10 minutes, okay. Hallucinogen, the term of the favored by many chemists, but mainly in psychiatry and psychology. Okay, this is the OED definition of hallucination: the apparent or alleged perception of an object not actually present. And as a noun, hallucinogen, a drug causing hallucinations. In other words, causing an experience of unreality or an illusion or a delusion. Psychedelic is defined adjective 1A, expanding the mind's awareness, etc., especially through the use of hallucinogenic drugs. And so we've just seen that hallucinogenic drugs cause hallucinations, perception of something not there. I've taken them, I don't know how many times, many hundreds. I've never had that experience at all. I see more of what's there, but not what's something that's not there and is only apparent. Hallucinogen is a noun, a drug causing hallucinations. But on the other side of the Atlantic, more or less the equivalent of the Oxford Encyclopedic Dictionary, which has about 200,000 words, about a third the content, and shorter definitions, but it's very, very good, very comprehensive. It's called the American Heritage Dictionary, defines psychedelic thus: of, pertaining to, or generating hallucinations, distortions of perception, and occasionally states resembling psychosis. And so that's what a judge or your neighbor or someone that's not in this small circle will take from this. It's something that causes hallucinations and occasionally even psychosis. Okay, let's go on with some more words. Then in 1979, in the journal of then Psychedelic Drugs, we invented entheogen. Entheos is what the Greeks called this. It meant divine possession because they believed that inspiration, poetic, musical, theatrical, shamanic, divination was because the divinity had come inside one's body, and so they called that entheos, a deity within. And the suffix gen does not mean generating, and it cannot mean generating. It means becoming. And we state this very clearly in the article, which is very short, that it means becoming divine within. And that's how the Greeks basically perceived this. The word has been criticized in print by Ralph Metzer, Marlene Dr. Rios, Jace Calloway, many others, because it says generating, and I agree with him on this point because they didn't read the article and they didn't even cite it. But the reason is Antoine Lavoisier created this usage as a suffix in science with the word oxygène, which meant engendrant l'acide, engendering acid, and hydrogène, oxygen and hydrogen, engendrant l'eau, engendering water. So for scientific nonce words, it came to be universally used as to mean producing something, as if generating, if you would. And it's cognate with that, it sounds like that. But etymologically, it means becoming. And just as she became angry, he became upset, we become divine within by this. And so that was our rationale. And it was not, we were not intending to replace psychedelic or hallucinogen. It's not a synonym. It's not a chemical or pharmacological term. It refers to the context of use and the attitude behind that. And so we state very specifically it's states of shamanic possession or later religious spiritual use in the context of religion in generating becoming divine within, whether by plants, their extracts, or artificial compounds. This is all very clear in the article, which is very short. But nobody read it, and I think I'm the only one that cited it much, and Christian, my friends. Okay, so that's enough of that. I already explained you. So, psychedelic does have meaning in medicine, but it refers to a very specific type of therapy, which is high dose, 250, 500 micrograms or above, and not very frequent ingestions, and that was Humphrey Osmond principally. And Psycholytic was Hans Karl Leuner about the same time in Germany, and that was lower doses over repeatedly. And there's a vast literature. There are thousands of papers, research papers, clinical studies, human subjects, many of them anecdotal from a physician. But so psychedelic already has a specific meaning in therapy. And it was only LSD. They were only talking about LSD. MDMA would not have been considered either for psycholytic or psychedelic therapy. The other problem with psychedelic is it's a term, it's a modern term, it's not correct etymologically. It should be psychodelic, although it would sound about the same. Maybe I'm being pernickety to stress that even if it sounds the same, it should be written the same. But in any case, it's definitely anchored in the 1960s, and it suggests a countercultural, somewhat anti-war, and it suggests psychedelic art, psychedelic music, that's all about the 1960s, and about LSD, which was almost the only thing used then and available widely. And so psychedelic really refers to LSD, and psychedelic is about the 1960s. It is not at all correct. It's culturally appropriative to say a psychedelic shamanism or a shaman using a psychedelic plant. The shamans I have known don't know anything about psychedelics. They maybe never even heard of LSD or any of these kinds of therapies. And so it's not an appropriate term. It's pejorative to just about everyone, besides this really small circle. Never mind that in places like Mexico and so forth, it suggests Charles Manson, the murders in Hollywood in 1969. And that's when suddenly we want so-called organic, plant-based, not LSD, that's a chemical, that's bad, and so forth, because it got a bad name, and it was headline news, all negative for a long time under that name, psychedelic. And it definitely is a pejorative term. And if you wish to change the society's attitude toward these substances, to mainstream them, as I've heard people here say, you shoot yourself in the foot right off the bat by calling them psychedelics, because people, they are synonyms of hallucinogen, psychotomimetic, psychodyspeptic, and so forth. And they do not apply to shamanism at all. That's why we created the term entheogen. And I'm out of time, but to conclude, I will give a final insoluble problem with this. And I will read a little something. I had to write entheogens too, addressing some of this criticism by people that evidently didn't even read the paper. This was 96, much later. Wasson had died 10 years earlier, and addressing their specious and spurious criticisms, because they criticize it and it doesn't generate anything, but we said the word doesn't mean that. And so it's not good. The problem is we were looking for a term equivalent to shamanic inebriant or plant teacher in the shamanic context. And so it had to include Amanita muscaria, Salvia divinorum, peyote, tobacco, coca, tryptamine snuffs, iboga, things that have nothing in common chemically and many of them very little in common pharmacologically. There's no way to join them together in a pharmacological or chemical scheme. This is a cultural term about the context of use. And so it refers to the context, not to the pharmacology. And so there's not an entheogenic effect. There's an entheogenic use. It's the context. And the respect, it's a pre-literate world, non-materialistic view, what I call translinguistic, that one can access through these, is what entheogen is meant to describe, not hallucinations. And so I propose, I won't have time to read it, but it was just Terence and a few others saying, you know, the Amanita muscaria is not a psychedelic, it's kind of hallucinogenic, and Dale Pendle and so forth, and they were all saying, you know, this one is this, and this one is sort of that, and they couldn't fit it together. That's why we brought this word out, and Terence criticized it as a clumsy word freighted with theological baggage in a book entitled Food of the Gods, no less. And there's one thing that I have to say that I didn't, apropos of that, is what does psychedelic mean? I said psych means breath, life, soul, but since the 17th century, this is from the original OED, the first edition, Oxford English Dictionary, since the 17th century, taken as a formative in the sense of mind. That is psych or psycho. Psyche also is basically the same. Breath, to breathe, hence life, etc. But Delic comes from Delos, which is an island in the Aegean, and that's the mythical birthplace of Apollo and Artemis. And the word Delic, that people take to mean mind manifesting, which is a meaningless thing. I don't see any meaning in saying mind manifesting. To me, it's mind annihilating, and mind manifesting doesn't mean anything coherent to me. But that's just me. But Delic comes from a root, D-E-I-W. I wouldn't really quite know how to pronounce it, which means to shine. And it was originally the word for the sun god, a sky god. It means to shine. And it is cognate, meaning it is directly related linguistically with Deus, or God, in Latin, and with Zeus, or the king of the gods, in Greek. And so what psychedelic really means is God-minded, like a hairless Krishna out on the street, or some Mormon, or I don't like religious people, I won't go there. And so, but really, very literally, it means God breathing. But God is very much in it, and entheogen has also been criticized because it's a theological word, and so on and so forth. But never mind that theological is a pleonasm. Theos and logos are the same thing in Greek, and so this talk of theology is anyway. The title of this article, Entheogens 2, is on entheology and entheobotany, because someone had proposed entheology. And I said, well, I prefer I prefer to focus not on theologists, but on botanists and on plants and shamans that use them. But I'm afraid I've run out of time. I certainly won't have time for questions. Maybe I have 1 minute. I might be able to stretch it into 2 or 3. Let's just see if I can read something else that's really dynamic to end with a flash. Maybe I can fall off of this thing. Let's see. Okay, well, this is the payoff pitch. I almost forgot. So where do we go from here? We need a different word. It's quite clear that none of them are adequate. And entheogen doesn't apply to a medical renaissance, and so it's a different context. It's a word for ethnographers, but maybe it's and ethnobotanists, maybe it's not needed by pharmacologists or phytochemists, and it certainly doesn't apply to modern medicine. It could, and I suppose, in a sense, Albert wanted the new knew Aloysius, but that was a religion. I don't like religions, you already know that. I said I wouldn't go there, and there I went right away. I can't write about anything without drugs coming in and knocking religion right after it. I say don't believe anything. I try not to believe anything except in myself, my friends, and my drugs. And I'm being serious. It wasn't meant to be a joke, but what I propose we need a new word, but why reinvent the wheel? I wrote a whole book about this called The Age of Entheogens and the Angel's Dictionary. And the Angel's Dictionary is a lexicon of all the words I could dig out of the OED, and like 25% of them are indigenous words, 70 different languages that referred to visionary states and so on and so forth. And what I think is the proper word for this is psychoptic. And this is already in the OED. We had to wait 25 years to get entheogen in the OED, but psychoptic has been in it for a long time, and it was used originally as the psychoptic looking glass, which was called a magic lantern. It was like an early type of projector, primitive type of projector, and which is also called a phantasmagoria. That's where that word comes from and is related to fantastic. And so it's only been used in the title of the book and by me as far as I know, and it's a generally unknown word. There is a scientific term very similar, psychoptic, which is a psychophysical term referring to the psychophysics of the vision, how we construct the physics of how this works. But it's double O. And nobody, I've only heard that spoken by myself, that particular word. So psychoptic, this is how that is defined. I'm very good at making a lot of information on one page, but then I can never read it. Psyche. This won't take long, I just have to find it. So I want to give it directly. But it means of vision of the mind or soul. Of vision of the mind or soul. So you already have the spiritual part and the the logical mental part. And any term, the essence of this experience, it's primarily for me auditory. I'm not a visual artist, I'm a writer, but for most people they're big colors and they talk about things that they see, and it enables you to see the world as energy and not as matter. The term must include something about vision, obviously. I mean, it's just obvious. And psychoptic couldn't be clearer. Psychoptic. The mind, the eyes, vision, mind, mental vision, and it's defined as also soul vision. And so that's the perfect word for it. It's not pejorative because no one's ever heard it before, so it doesn't have any positive or negative connotation. It just referred to some antique type of entertainment device, which most people have never heard of anyway. And so I'm definitely out of time. I thank you for your attention. Please, one last thing.
Thank you very much, Jonathon.
Can I just say one last thing?
Oh.
The title of this is Obsequies. I wrote it up already for the next BC book, and it's about 25 pages, much more detail, is Obsequies for the Psychedelic Renaissance. Something about the psychoptic resurgence. That's what I call it, the psychoptic resurgence. Don't shoot yourselves in the foot. Call it something that doesn't prejudice it. Thank you for your attention.